Hi, I'm Brian Welk here in TheWrap's virtual studios for the Sundance Film Festival for 2021. And today I'm joined by the director of A Glitch in the Matrix, director Rodney Asher. Rodney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. How's Park City?
It's virtual, just like this simulation that we're all living in. This movie is a documentary, The Glitch in the Matrix. It's about whether we're living in a simulation, about people who have who believe this and who have explored this really deeply. One of your first films was focused on people who are obsessed with The Shining in Room 237. I think there's a big question now about like our own reality, our own sense of what's true and what's not. But was there a specific reason you wanted to look at this theory and this movie, The Matrix, in particular?
Well, I mean, first off, if you haven't seen the movie, this isn't focused on The Matrix, in nearly the same way that 237 was about The Shining. We talk much more about simulation theory in a broader sense, and absolutely, The Matrix comes up now and again as sort of one of the biggest milestones in mainstreaming the idea. But it wasn't necessarily a fascination with the Matrix that led to this as much of a fan as I am of the movie, but just as a way of, sort of in the cycle of these past films, 237, The Nightmare in this one, they're all about sort of unsolved and possibly unsolvable mysteries. Right? What does a piece of art mean? What does, in The Nightmare, what does, the things we see and, this sort of dream state mean? Is the supernatural real? And, this one seems to be, a much more fundamental question of, what is reality? And, once I came across the idea of simulation theory, and that was during the making of The Nightmare, like those other two ones, it was a topic that I just couldn't stop thinking about, a rabbit hole that I couldn't, crawl out of. And, sort of one of the lessons I've learned in these projects is, the way out is through.
I mean, and you're right. It's not just about The Matrix. You end up roping in so many different, pop culture elements and parallels that really make you think about this. And you tie it to religion, you tie it to how we operate within video games and the psychology behind that. I guess like, and it ends up getting to a real disturbing side by the end. So was there anything that, first, drew you in initially? And, was there, as you were discussing this with other people, things that maybe scared you about it, or, that you had some skepticism towards?
Well, I mean, certainly there's things that scare me about them, and knock on wood, the film, kind of, deals with those fears straight on, right? That there's a couple of real anxiety-producing, questions that leap quite naturally from simulation theory. The first of is, am I losing my mind? That to think this. The other is, what is it? What does this mean about other people? There's a big fork in the road in simulation theory. If this is all a big video game somewhere, well, is this a one-person game and everybody is a computer-controlled avatar? Or is everybody in here? Is this a networked game like Fortnite or Battlefront or what have you, or is this Pac-Man, and the implications of that, right? What that means about how you interact with other human beings, can't be overstated.
Yeah, there's like a person who said it's just probability in many ways that some of these people who we see or just walk by every day are probably NPCs, are non-player characters. It's really wild, and there's many different facets of it, and it sounds like not everyone believes the same theories within it. So tell me about how you found some of these people who are profiled in the film, these individuals who are through these different avatars. They're very unusual to look at. Yeah, where did you find them, and what was your reaction in talking to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing is, we didn't find them at all. They found us. That we announced that we were making this project and, set up a place where people could reach us online. And Boing Boing, in particular, wrote a article about it, which, they're a site that has a tremendous reach in sort of the arts and technology communities. And, from there, all four of those people were folks who had reached out to us, people who wanted to share their stories. And, when talking to them, I want to hear about, what they think simulation theory really means and the implications of it. But, I also really wanted to know, sort of their human stories, right? Like where they were in their lives when this idea, sort of captured their imaginations, and how it's changed, how it's changed their lives, how it's changed, how they react, how they deal with other people, what's going on with them day to day. And those are things, and those are people that I never would have been capable of finding on our own, and getting to hear stories like, Paul driving to St. Louis with his dad and imagining the idea of a movie screen in front of the car as people are changing the set dressing around him. Our stories and our ideas that, a Google search isn't going to turn up.
Why the look that you gave for them, or did they request that particular avatar?
No, well, the idea was sort of to comment on, where digital communication is going and what it's like to interact with people these days, right? Like I'm talking to you, via a video chat line, and I'm sure that there's a real person on the other side of this call, but in my experience, what I'm seeing, is an 1.5 inch tall, little animated person, probably 500 pixels by 500 pixels, constantly shifting in the side, and and electronic voice coming into my headset. That these days, more and more and more, we're interacting with people digitally, electronically, sometimes like we are here, photographically. Although I noticed that your background is, is artificial, is an image of Park City, which I don't suspect is real. So there's already a half real, half fantastical quality, about the way you're presenting yourself to me now. So we were playing with that idea, right? We flipped it so that the background is whatever real world, arbitrary location they happen to be Skyping to me from. But then we replaced the people with avatars that are supposed to be sort of reminiscent of game characters, right? The way that people don't just play games, they socialize there, right? Like Fortnite, for my son, isn't a game that he plays so much as a destination that he goes, and a place where he socializes, and he'll be, a 10-foot tall cybernetic warrior from the future, or maybe Deadpool or Kylo Ren, but he'll be talking about, fifth grade and homework and snacks to his friends. I'm often texting with people, and I'll send emojis or GIFs to express the way I'm feeling. So it felt like leaning into that kind of that place where digital communication is going had a lot to say about the idea of living in digital unreality.
Did you film this during COVID, or was it always the plan to do it through Skype and through that virtual format anyway?
Yeah, it was always the plan. We filmed those interviews in 2019. It's just a very strange coincidence that the movie's being released into a world where these sorts of video chats, Skype, Zoom, StreamYards are becoming more and more ubiquitous, and I think maybe in some way seeing an animated character inside of this kind of a Skype call might feel like a satire of where we're at. But, it's one coincidence of, the hundreds that seem to gather around all these projects.
I mean, you have a lot of very serious, respected people in this movie talking about simulation theory with straight face. The big running thread through the movie is Philip K. Dick, but you also have Elon Musk and lots of other scientists and like pop culture figures who have talked about this and believe it maybe to some degree. I don't know if you tried to talk to any of those individuals, or are you surprised that it's maybe become more mainstream.
Well, I mean, it's increased. It became more mainstream in the course of making this movie, which of course made it feel like a more interesting thing to talk about, right? I mean, we reached out to Elon Musk. We weren't able to talk to him, but including, that Q&A, that event that he was at, where he spoke about his feelings about simulation theory, seemed like a really important milestone, again, in the mainstreaming of this, right? Because you can read people talking about this in a Reddit thread, and perhaps dismiss it, but when the richest, most influential person in the world takes it seriously, when Neil deGrasse Tyson takes it seriously, or to put it plainly, when people smarter than me think that it's a scientific plausibility, well, I can, I can put my hands up and say, well, it's plausible anyway, right? As a scientific possibility. Whether or not I can get my head around, quantum entanglement or Planck's constant or any of the sort of bleeding edge pieces of science that are relevant when looking at this as a scientific idea. But then again, I think as far as the movie goes, there's sort of two ways to look at it, and I think there's two ways that we talk about it. There is the scientific possibility that reality is digitally constructed in some kind of hyper advanced computer somewhere out there. But then there's also, what's probably more relevant to our day-to-day life, the idea of simulation theory as a metaphor, the question of the model of reality that each of us are living in, who built that? Did we are we living in a genuine reflection of real reality, or is it a construction that comes from our past, our families, our peer group, our media diet, our senses, our biases? I think it's a question that's become more and more relevant, especially the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to say, well, it could just be another way of thinking about religion, or but there's something else going on here, and they don't just see it as like, this is my religion, or this is where what I believe. I think as I was watching the film, it seems like there's something else psychologically, or a different way of thinking about it that isn't as old as time.
Well, sure. And again, that's getting into, well, if it's literally true, then it's a new idea and it's a new truth, and it's something that you can probe with physics. But as a metaphor, it does go back to, Plato's cave and Descartes and Zhuangzi and his dream of the butterfly, or, Borges' map in exactitude in science, and the map in the territory. That questions of how real is the real world, are ancient.
Okay. I'm curious, there's a lot of men interviewed in this film, and this isn't a comment on who you chose to interview.
No, it's totally fair. I know where you're going.
Yeah. Like, is this something that, we see more often in men in terms of their psychology about thinking about simulations? And yeah, I don't know if that was an aspect that you came across as you were discussing this.
Yeah, well, it's certainly something I noticed, right? That in the people who responded to our questionnaire, not all of them, but most of them were men, right? And at least the four that are in the film, they're white men. And on the one hand, and that brings us to another question, and I think it's a completely fair question. One of them is, did we, is there a bigger community of people who believe this, who don't necessarily look exactly like me, and were we remiss in not finding avenues to reach out to them that weren't the ones that weren't the ones that we used? Or is this an idea that is of a special interest, to men, into white men? And if so, why would that be? We certainly didn't talk to enough people to consider this group much of a statistically significant sample, but as anecdotal evidence, it seems to be. And, I think it's a completely fair and sort of fascinating question to ask. Well, why would this appeal? Why would this idea, appeal to them more than to other folks? And one idea that was tossed out in conversation, I think Paul said this during the Q&A, that it might be that from our privilege, we may feel like there's fewer ramifications for talking about this publicly. We're less worried about being seen as kooky or unstable than other people might. But I think that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question to continue after the film. I'm hoping that this movie provokes a huge amount of conversation. I never feel like these projects end with a concrete message, conclusion, moral to take out of it, so much as questions and conversations to continue after we're done.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's a really fascinating film. And best of luck with it. I know it's coming out very soon in theaters and it just being available. So
yeah, it drops on the 5th.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.